G'day guys, back with the Art Circle. Today I want to talk about this particular video, that soy is ruining Warhammer 40,000 by Commissar Gamza. I watched the video, took it in, I had a few different takeaways from it, and I want to do my own video on the subject because of that. I don't want to retread all the same ground that he did. Invariably, some things are going to conflict with each other. So today I don't want to talk about the politics. I don't want to talk about the soy or the incel or whatever demographic you can think of in that regard. I myself have criticised the kiddified art style of late and the lack of darkness. As long-time viewers of my channel would know, I'm a pretty rational guy, or at least I like to think myself that way, as I'm an engineer. So when I look at the argument, I don't ask myself if something is too woke. I ask myself the big question, is this approach working? So, what do I mean when I ask this? Well, let's clarify a few points first, because these points or questions, they're too important in order to actually reach the final conclusion. So, firstly, the big one is gatekeeping. Is it gatekeeping to have something which has worked for a really long time, and then to deny access to it to those who want to change it? On the surface, it's simple. Any artistic hobby is about expression. You can't deny expression. It's not your hobby. It's not a hobby that you personally own. It's someone else's hobby, and you're playing in that sandbox. But, to confuse matters, this isn't interpreting the hobby. This isn't interpretist at all. This is a defined hobby with a key scope, key aspects you need to adhere to in order to be fulfilling it as originally intended. So there are specific rules written in this regard, ways of painting, types of miniatures, ways you assemble them. Sure, you could assemble a Space Marine with part bits from the Imperial Guard and the Eldar and stuff like that. It might work, it probably won't. And when you create it, is it really Warhammer you've created, or just some weird abstract thing? You see, the changing fundamentals of the hobby, well, changing them, that's okay. However, you no longer have said hobby if you do so. You have something different now. If you take a sport, for example, and this is an analogy I'll use, like tennis, and you change the rackets to baseball bats, is it still tennis? At what point does it cease to be tennis and becomes a new sport? When you change the ball too? What about the lines on the court, if you change those? You see, there's a big difference between refinement, such as standardizing a product, standardizing the size of your racket, the balls, the court, etc., and changing what fundamentally defines an activity. Refinement is what Warhammer went through in the 90s, having no clear parameters in the 80s, just some interesting ideas, just being a setting for the game, and then becoming a locked-in fictional universe by the end of the next decade, with almost all of the key factions, named entities, units, gods, monsters, more than that, all in place by the end of the 90s. Nobody is stopping anyone from changing Warhammer models, lore, key concepts into whatever they like. But at some point, you will cross that line where it's fundamentally not Warhammer. This line is something subjective, and I could make a video all to itself about that subject. But lacking the time for this right now, I will simply say that the majority of fans probably don't know where the line is, but they definitely can tell you when they think it's been crossed. So, is it gatekeeping to keep something as it is, even at the risk of some stagnation? I honestly don't know. Personally, I do prefer the older style, somewhere between 3rd and 5th edition 40k for example. But I don't hate the refinement of rules that happened outside of those editions, some for the better, some for the worse. The fundamental change in the background universe irritated me far more. The key thing this hobby, like any hobby needs though, is new blood. And as the older players fade away, new players need to spring up in their place in order to keep the games alive. The huge problem is, how? The prevailing theory in marketing over the last 10 years has been that you need to widen your reach in search of this mythical wider audience, and this is done by diluting whatever makes your product, well, your product, and instead of making it better, you make it more generic. The thing is, I can't for the life of me actually think of a time when this has worked, when trying to make your product more generic and less like it originally was draws in more people. It might exist, and I'd love to hear examples of it, but I'm just not seeing it. What am I saying here? I'm saying that these marketing people have no fucking idea. Look at Star Wars, Star Trek, Doctor Who, all these major franchises dying a slow death because they're trying to appeal to everyone, and by doing so, appealing to nobody. They're hemorrhaging their core fan bases, which love the franchise and spent money on them. So, these fans, the ones that were so in love with their chosen franchise that they spoiled anything, no matter how questionable the quality was, this is the first demographic. They're the one that probably spends the most on an individual basis on the hobby. But they're also the small demographic. And I detest these people because I find them lacking in critical thought, complete puppets to some corporate dopamine. Conversely, they probably detest me for my Scrooge-like overly critical assessments. Now, these people are few, but they're definitely some of the most vocal I've noticed. We've all met the Games Workshop fanboy who defends a price rise in an already overpriced region, for instance. Against all odds, these people, they somehow find a string of logic that kind of convolutedly gets them to their happy place where it's okay, the company's doing the right thing. It's almost impressive in a sad way. So that audience is there. But what about the others? What are the other demographics? Well, there's my type of people, the semi-critical to very critical ones who like the product. We're happy for it to change, but only if it makes the product better and builds depth. Generally, we hate retcons, and we hate it when something which breaks canon happens, because if it destroys the immersion and the lore is played with so fast and loose, well, there may as well be no lore at all. This audience usually just ups and leaves if they get too shitty, and they make a lot of noise when doing so. I mean, basically it's why this channel exists. I don't want to leave, I like it, and I'm trying to improve what I have and work with what I've got. I'd say this audience is the majority. We're the people between ages 25 to 45, the ones who have money, we have jobs locked in, we have our gaming groups, we've been in it for a long time, we have shelves full of old White Dwarf stuff, but we also play some of the new games. The next demographic, they're the old school types, and they only want to play it one way. They don't buy anything, and nothing you do will pull their purse strings, because you're not making the product they care for currently. So, what's left? Those are the key demographics that are currently in this hobby. Well, everyone else on the planet, right? Well, maybe not. Let's break this down, because honestly, I haven't seen anyone else do this currently on the old YouTubes. The minimum age group that Games Workshop targets is 12-year-olds. That's what it says on the boxes, and that's what they suggest when people take little kids into the store. It's not that they won't let them, paint up a Space Marine or that kind of thing, but generally they want kids around the age of 12, because they can sort of grasp and get their head around the gameplay. But who wants to pay for their children to play this game? Almost no parent will fund this hobby beyond a box or two, except perhaps a parent who's already into the hobby themselves. Children are too fickle. They all have their moments of attention deficit, shall I say. They can't afford the hobby, and a shiny new object coming along will pull their attention in a new direction, such as a new computer game. The kiddie art style as well. It probably won't work for them, and the sharp contrast in style between the kiddie artwork and the codexes will confuse the parents. So you may as well say that the ages 12 to 16 are a bit of a wipeout here. So the next demographic, we'll say that's 16 years through to maybe the early 20s. This group are the real new blood. They're the ones that game at Games Workshop, and they do buy products. The problem is, they don't earn much money. The average person in this bracket would be lucky to earn maybe $20 an hour in Australia. In general, they're probably studying, university, college, that sort of thing, and they're also taking their first steps into the adult workforce. They're at an age where they must move out of home, they have to buy a car, start properly dating. By the way, newsflash to you young blokes, women, they're even more expensive than Warhammer, especially if you don't use condoms. That's free advice. This, then, would be the audience that you should target if you're the company. And it needs to be done with their particular likes in mind. But what are those likes? Well, most people that are drawn into a hobby, they don't want it to be completely different to their initial thing that interested them. So, they can't be drawn in by that kiddie style art and then shown full grimdark when they crack open a codex. because it insults their intelligence and it's not what they signed up for when they were initially interested in the product. Strangely, however, this group, I think, is targeted by that CalArt style cartoons deliberately. Those pictures are not aimed at children, they're aimed at this age group, the 16 to early 20s. I think by more of a social justice minded policy, and this misguided belief by marketing that somehow this is what they want, well, I venture to say it's not. You see, I don't know how this idea permeated within marketing departments, because every 16-year-old kid I know, they want to be treated like they're 21. Every guy wants to think he's a badass. Every girl wants to be treated like she's smart, independent, and as capable as she sees herself. And they don't want to be babied like they're school children. How are you going to impress this demographic by pulling the wool out from under them 5 minutes into collecting the game on their shoestring budgets? You see, I bring up the art style a lot here, and many people will say, oh, but that's just on their website, or, the public face, or the big poster up in the window of the store. In my mind, though, isn't that the problem? If it's the first thing people see, that's going to be the impression they form. You log onto the Games Workshop website and see some smiling custodian with his arms around the shoulder of an orc and they share a beer or something together. What the fuck is that supposed to mean? What does it have to do with anything? Why is that the image that greets me when I log onto a web store to see miniatures set in a universe where nothing is known but violence, death, and unending suffering? It's too much of a contrast of ideas. So it brings me back to the question I asked at the start of the video. Is this approach working? Now, many will say to me, Macca, Games Workshop shares are higher than ever. They're making more money than ever. How can you say it doesn't work? Well, on the surface, that's a fantastic point. However, as I've mentioned in many previous episodes, their share prices are based only on perceived value, like the entire share market is. The money they bring in, it's done by gouging companies and countries outside of the UK with fixed regional pricing. And that money they bring in has even more buying power when it gets back to the UK if their pound is low. They're whoring out of their IP in the digital domain, for instance, is a short-term solution, as eventually the demand will be filled. None of that is stable. Have they had success with Age of Sigmar 8th edition 40k? Undoubtedly, and to their credit. But is it sustainable long-term, especially with rising things like 3D printing? And I don't think so. I think people will grow very tired of the rapidly shifting meta and try to keep up. And eventually, they will get tired of trying to keep up and gradually fade away, as with every single edition prior. The only thing that completely stops people from leaving, well, it's new editions, basically, of the game. This leaves us with our demographics. Those who always support it, those that critique it and eventually will leave if they aren't listened to, those who can't afford it and those who want to afford it but have bigger issues on their plate, so they can't give it the support they want to. Do we really think that any level of gatekeeping is going to affect any of that? I don't know, but I can tell you this. If you don't think that the grimdark universe of 40k, for instance, watered down as I consider it to be compared to past installments, if you think that that universe is too dark for your kids, perhaps consider maybe it's not for them. You know what's best for your family. You know it better than a company. The company only wants your money. If you try and change the system for your child, are you not now being the selfish one, the gatekeeper who is taking what someone else already loves and trying to make it into something else to suit your personal agenda? I do not and likely will not ever understand that mentality. The mentality of those who see something and say, hey, that existing thing there, I need to change it entirely from what it is and what is beloved by many to suit my own agenda. By all means, change it in the privacy of your own home or in a group of like-minded individuals. I wouldn't dare oppose this, but by the same token, don't you dare try and come into someone else's place and tell them the thing they love isn't good and that it needs to change. You can critique it, sure, I do that all the time here, taking shots across the bow of Games Workshop whenever they slip up. The difference is in recognising that you've changed the core of something, moulded it into something else, and that's the problem here. It's not with soy, but with people who take an existing IP and change it dramatically, alienating and driving away the core audience. You can't impress these people. No matter how much you change something, it will never be good enough. but they make noise, and you want their business as a company, so you keep catering to them. Bad idea after bad idea, and then you end up with problems. Go talk to the comic book manufacturers like Marvel and ask them how well their characters are doing right now. In ending this video, I'd like to say it isn't gatekeeping at all. The more I think about it, it's not gatekeeping to protect something you love. If you can't preserve what you have, why even have it at all? Nobody's standing there saying you can't have Space Marines, that you can't paint them pink, that you can't make them all women. What they're saying is that you can't come into the wider community, plonk them on a table and say that it's canon, and that it's fine, and that it isn't ruining the experience of everyone around you. You're right to have your little side project which resembles Warhammer, but it doesn't supersede the right of everyone else who is playing the true game, the one closest to the original vision. You can have your vision, play it with the people who accept it, but don't come into the wider community and try and change their version. It will only end with conflict. Anyway, I'm back with the Outer Circle. I know this is a bit of a touchy topic for people, but please, I want to hear your thoughts and feedback in the comments below, as always. If you did watch Commissar Gamza's video, let me know what you think of that too. I'm pretty interested in it. Will it annoy YouTube? Yeah, probably. Everything annoys YouTube, but I don't care. Because it needs to be said. Anyone can paint anything, they can do anything they like with their models, but at the end of the day, if you come into the wider community, which all accepts that the game is one way, tell them they're all idiots and that it should be this other way, it's not going to work out well for you. I'm back with the Outer Circle. Thanks all for watching, and see you all next time.